We are live. Hello, everybody. Welcome. We'll kind of give a minute for people to jump on. It is, what day of the week is it? It's been a long week, hasn't
It's
it?
Wednesday. It's Wednesday.
It's Wednesday. It feels like next Friday, honestly, based on how the week has gone in the news. I'm sure you feel that even more than I do, but here we are. Welcome, everybody. What a week. We do have a lot of new folks around here at Pope Leo Weekly. A lot of new faces, a lot of people joining us for the first time. So if you are new around here, my name's Sarah Carter. I am the creator and the author here at Pope Leo Weekly. And if you are here because you are looking for thoughtful analysis of this week's events, you are in the right place. So welcome. Glad to have you. While we wait for people to join, I'm wondering, maybe we could start with just dropping in the chat, everybody, where you're tuning in from. We'd love to know, where are you at? And while we talk today too, I'll just mention, please don't be shy. If you have questions for Colleen, this is a great opportunity to ask them. So do drop those in the chat if you've got some questions. Utilize that feature here. So we'll just kind of let people jump on. Again, go ahead and write where you're from if you want to. But what a gift it is to have you, Colleen. Today we have with us Colleen Dulle. I said that right?
Yeah, you did.
Yay. Okay. Colleen is a Vatican correspondent for America Magazine. She's the host of the Inside the Vatican podcast, which is produced by America Media. She was an ABC News contributor for the 2025 conclave and appears frequently as a commentator on Vatican news for both national and international outlets. So she is very accomplished, very well respected in the Catholic news world. And she currently lives in New Orleans, if your bio is up to date. That's so exciting. Yeah. Additionally, Colleen also wrote a book. Her book is called Struck Down, Not Destroyed, Keeping the Faith as a Vatican Reporter. Yay, there it is.
I'm always ready.
The cover is so fun. I love it so much. I mean, I know it's a very serious book, but the cover is great. It's really...
Yeah, I worked with this TikTok famous designer, and I'm so glad I did. He did such a good job.
It's really awesome. So thank you, Colleen, for being here. We're really glad to have you.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah. I'm wondering, let's just start with, maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you currently do for America.
Yeah, sure. So I have been working for America Magazine since I graduated college. I was a O'Hare Fellow, and then they decided to keep me on full time. I did some podcast and video production for a few years, and then I switched over to the print side, which there's never really a print, exclusive thing anymore in today's media. So nowadays I write and I edit and solicit also Vatican commentaries in print. And then I do a weekly podcast called Inside the Vatican that I co-host with our Rome correspondent, Jerry O'Connell, who's been there since 1985. So really great perspective he brings. We come from different backgrounds, which always makes for an interesting discussion. And then I also do some YouTube explainer stuff, some TV, like you mentioned. So kind of in whatever platform I can talk about the Vatican, I do.
And sometimes you do little creators like me an awesome favor by coming on live on Substack for a little chat.
I mean, I don't have a good way of answering people's questions right now. So this is a great way to do that.
That's awesome. Somebody asked if you would show the cover of your book again.
Oh, heck yeah. Here you go. Struck Down, Not Destroyed. Yeah.
So awesome. And how many pages is this book?
It's short. It's probably 150.
Beautiful.
The fact that I don't know off the top of my head. 147.
That's awesome. So
yeah, you can get through it, and a lot of people read it in an evening and a morning.
Amazing.
Yeah.
That's great. Hopefully we can talk a little bit more about your book as time permits, at the end. But
yeah.
Okay. So big week in Catholic news. And as all of you probably are aware, there's been a little word skirmish between the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and the current Pope, Pope Leo XIV. That's taken place over the past, basically, about a week. So these are arguably the two most influential Americans on the planet, you could say. And they're in this little clash of titans right now. And there's a lot of people talking about this. This has garnered a lot of media attention in both secular and Catholic outlets. So I'm wondering if you are willing to just sort of walk us all through the sequence of events that has taken place and focus on what Pope Leo actually said in the course of these events.
Oh, sure. Yeah, we can take a pretty long view, or we can take like a short immediate events view. Which one would you
Let's do immediate. Kind of
Okay,
the
yeah.
big newsy.
Yeah. So the big news is that on Sunday night, President Trump posted this very long, 338 word Truth Social post, which opened with Pope Leo is weak on crime and terrible for foreign policy. And then it goes a lot of other places, very stream of consciousness. So he then goes into, he talks about like, I don't like the Pope, but I like his brother, Louis, who is MAGA all the way, or he says all MAGA. He talks about how Leo should be grateful for the conclave electing him and how Trump was the reason that the cardinals elected an American. We can talk about that. That's kind of actually an interesting analysis line. And then he also talks about, that the Pope should be, sticking to the Catholic Church rather than criticizing what he does. Trump was then asked about this post by reporters, and he continued by saying that he is not a fan of Pope Leo. And there's just been kind of pile on since then. So just this morning, JD Vance said that the Pope needs to stay out of politics. I think he said it twice now. Um, Right. So that's the big news item. And then in the morning, so that was Sunday night, Monday morning, Pope Leo leaves on this 10-day trip across Africa. He's going to Algeria, just went to Algeria. He's in Cameroon right now. Then he goes to Equatorial Guinea and Angola. I might have the order mixed up there. So on a papal trip, the Pope gets on the plane, and the way that, in part, the way they fund these trips for the Pope is that journalists ride on the plane in the back with the Pope. They pay up because they get some access, and so basically, the Pope comes back on those departure flights and speaks to all the journalists, and obviously everybody was like, "Any comment? Any comment?" And kind of in a break from usual Vatican practice, I would say. Like, ordinarily, we would just hear, "Oh, I haven't read it," or like, "Oh, no comment, whatever." Leo responded to like everybody who asked about him, who asked about it, and was very frank. He was like, "My message is the message of the gospel. I'm not afraid of the Trump administration. I'm not going to shy away from preaching what I see as the message of the gospel, which is blessed are the peacemakers." He said, "Too many innocent people are being killed, and so somebody has to stand up." Those were some of the big quotes that he gave, but he talked to quite a few people about this. And then he landed on the ground in Algeria and started in with his message of peace and international cooperation, which is exactly what he's supposed to do. Um, Meanwhile, there was also this thing. So right after the president's post on Sunday night, he also published this picture, AI image of himself as like a Christ-like figure. He said later on Monday, or maybe it was yesterday, no, Monday, that it was him as a doctor. So people have been kind of making fun of that online. Like, how many doctors do you know that wear, old-timey robes and heal people with like a glowing orb in their hand? So that's been kind of one of the offshoots of the conversation. That picture got a lot of pushback from Trump's like evangelical base, which is interesting. People who may not be offended by him going head to head with the Pope, but are upset that he would, liken himself to Jesus. And then you had the Vance pile on this morning, and meanwhile, it's just been kind of a lot of analysis pieces since then. But those are kind of the news hits. And I would also add here that I think that the Trump post was in response to the 60 Minutes interview that aired Sunday night, like 2 hours before he posted. This was with three American cardinals. So Cardinal Supich of Chicago, Cardinal Tobin of Newark, New Jersey, and Cardinal McElroy of DC, in which they got together, gave an interview to Norah O'Donnell on 60 Minutes, and they were like, basically, they talked about immigration and they talked about the war, and they backed up Pope Leo's views on all of those things, as those guys have been known to do. So, yeah, I think the idea is probably that Trump watched this broadcast and then this was his response. it also interestingly comes the day after Pope Leo held a prayer vigil for peace in St. Peter's Basilica.
Lots of thoughts about that. I've heard reports that Trump was kind of particularly outraged by the 60 Minutes interview. I have no idea how credible that story is, but it checks out with kind of everything that we know. There's a lot of interesting things that the president has said over the course of the last week. I would like to focus on Pope Leo because the reality is so much of what Trump has said is just predictable. It's so par for the course that you can almost have guessed what he would say next, and you can sort of guess what he will say next. But as you've mentioned, what's kind of interesting about this situation is that Pope Leo he's kind of rising to the moment and allowing that sort of frontal challenge to take place, and he's engaging it. So, as you've said, that's pretty unusual. Why do you think he's choosing to engage directly right now? There's a lot of times in history where it would have been potentially appropriate for a pope to do it. Why now?
You know, I think that Leo is a very skilled communicator. I think he especially has an understanding of how, like, the American news cycle, news media works. It's the guy who followed the news very closely, who was on Twitter. So he gets it. Um, and he knows that he had an opportunity right now on the plane with those reporters to redirect the conversation, you know, away from Trump and towards what he sees as the gospel message.
Mhm.
Um, I think that's his primary motivation here. I think maybe responding to the reporters right away is one. It's a matter of circumstance. Like, it was just an accident that the Pope was going to be on a plane with a bunch of journalists. Usually we would have to wait until a Tuesday where he would be at Castel Gandolfo, where he gives some of those Tuesday night press conferences or press comments to get anything on this. So he just happened to be asked about it earlier. But I think that it's interesting that he's made the decision, especially in recent weeks, and it wasn't just in this instance, but also at one of those Castel Gandolfo commentaries, when he's been using Trump's name more, which is unusual.
Yeah.
The Vatican generally doesn't like to do this. They don't like to uh, name aggressors and conflicts usually, and they don't call out specific political leaders. And here he has used the president's name. That's interesting. To me, it feels like he just knows that that message will go farther with people,
Mhm.
that it won't make it. I think that there is a sense of, why aren't you just being transparent in the past when the Vatican has, shied away from naming specific people when it's very obvious who they're talking about. And so I think, yeah, in both cases, it's been when he's been asked specifically about Trump, I believe. So perhaps it's that. But yeah, he's not gonna like dodge it, which is interesting.
I I'm wondering about sorry, I've got like a little thing stuck in my foot. So the way this is getting framed in the media in a lot of situations is that Trump and the Pope are going head to head, and it's kind of this personal conflict.
Mhm.
And Pope Leo and Donald Trump are being sort of set up in a lot of media narrative as kind of um, these foils of one another, and these two ends of a spectrum in American life. And Leo is sometimes being framed up as kind of like the anti-Trump. I'm wondering what you think of that analysis and whether that's helpful, whether that's true. What do you think of it?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. I mean, there's certainly an extent to which Leo is a counterweight to Trump on the global stage. Like, he is a different example of what America can be. So I've heard some people analyze this and I tend to agree with it as the Cardinals voting for Leo in the conclave were in a way voting for an image of America that is kind of bygone, but that they would still like to see, which is this very post World War II, we are the, guarantors of democracy, we're standing up for what's right, whatever. The rules-based order, I think, especially. Now, you can argue certainly that the United States has violated that many times in even the not so recent past. However, yeah, people see him as an example of what America maybe once was in their imaginations, what they would like it to be. Um, and Trump is kind of the opposite of that in many ways, or at least Leo has lamented that he's going against that rules-based international order. He said that in an address to diplomats who are accredited to the Holy See on January 9th of this year.
Mhm.
So, like, broader narrative, I think that Leo has been slowly growing into his public voice, and getting more comfortable speaking more directly on issues. Um, but yeah, but also he's not just a counterweight to Trump, right? Like, the Pope's job is so much more than that. He is not I disagree with the narrative that he was elected just because he's American. When I was covering the conclave, everybody was like, "Oh, they'll never elect an American." And I think maybe the, like, philosophy around why it could have changed is summarized well in a quote from, Cardinal George, who, at least is reputed to have said, that we'll never have an American pope until the United States is in political decline.
Mm.
And so the idea was, you know, the Trump era and the loss of esteem for the United States on the international stage led some cardinals to be open to the idea of an American pope, whereas in the past it would have been just impossible. And that impossibility was linked to the US's status as a global superpower, right? We're still a superpower. However, there's been like this loss of legitimacy. So I think that that's an interesting way to come at it. But yeah, obviously, like, the Pope is the Pope of the entire world. I think it was very telling that when he came out on the balcony for the first time on May 8th, that he didn't speak in English, even though the world was watching and he would have been understood by many, many people, not just his own fellow countrymen, right? But he
Yes.
spoke in Italian primarily and then a little bit in Spanish to give a shout out to his diocese in Peru.
Yes.
Um, he knew that there would be an attempt to see him as the American Pope, and I
Mhm.
think the message he wanted to send with those languages was to say, "I am the Bishop of Rome, primarily. That is my title, that is my job. And then also I am pastor of this worldwide community." I think he was trying to downplay the Americanness and didn't speak in English publicly until the next day with the cardinals. Yeah.
It was almost shocking to me that there did seem to be a point, an inflection point in Leo's papacy where he started speaking English in public a lot more.
Mm,
And at the beginning, I wondered why he wasn't doing it more, but it does seem like there was just kind of like an onboarding period where he wasn't necessarily going for that angle as much. I like your analysis. I tend to agree. I think when Pope Francis comes out on the loggia and he says "Buonasera" and he starts speaking and he that Spanish moment, that's just very different. It's loaded in a different way than an American pope coming out on the loggia and saying, "Hey," or whatever he would have said,
yeah,
"Good
yeah.
evening." That would have, felt very different, I think, than a Latin American pope coming out on the loggia and speaking Spanish. So I like
But
that you
did
brought that
did
up.
Francis speak Spanish in that first appearance? I thought he only spoke Italian.
His first words when he came out on the loggia were
Yeah.
"Buonasera." So he was his or is that Italian? Did he speak?
Buonasera. Yeah, buonasera is Italian.
Oh,
But I'm not now I'm racking my brain, like, did he say anything in
no,
Spanish? And I don't
no, no, me too. Maybe I got that wrong. Okay.
That's okay.
Well, don't quote me on that. I'm not the Vatican journalist. But, I think maybe what I'm trying to say is I think that the significance of the Latin American Pope, and him kind of embracing his own culture and bringing that into the forefront of his own papacy
Mhm.
is different than an American Pope, like a US Pope coming out and kind of front burnering his own, United States identity.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
and it would have landed horribly with the people he is actually the bishop of, right? Like,
yeah,
I saw so many, like, reaction videos that Italians had taken of, like, their grandma watching or whatever when Leo was elected. And, the Italians had been rooting for the Italians in the conclave.
Yes.
That's pretty normal. But, I mean, they were so disappointed. They were like, "An American? Are you kidding me?"
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
I think he knew that, he's lived in Italy for years. He knew that would be probably received that way too.
I've also heard, that I think I just heard this as sort of like a hearsay thing from one of the cardinals, that his analysis and the way what he makes of Leo, this American pope, was that the American cardinals of the conclave really did not see him as one of them, that he's kind of an outsider within the cohort of American cardinals because of how much time he spent in Latin America, South America, in Peru. So there is something interesting about Pope Leo being an American pope, but also kind of being an outsider to the American church too.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the line that we always heard in the conclave was, "He is the least American of the Americans." I don't know that he's necessarily, like, excluded or whatever from, the kind of Supich, Tobin, even Dolan, group, and I think that actually all of those guys got behind him by the end of the conclave. Certainly Supich, we know, was active in campaigning for, Prevost. Um, but yeah, no, he was, because he spent so much time in Peru, also as, like, a global traveler as head of the Augustinians, and even just, in the last over the course of the Francis papacy as a Peru-based bishop. Um, yeah, certainly, he was able to get the Latin Americans behind him in a way
Mhm.
where they saw him as one of their own, right? A lot of people felt that they could claim him,
Yes.
which helped him. Yeah,
Yeah, yes. And I think that's one of his strengths as a pope because he just
certainly.
doesn't neatly fit into one category or another. I think you
He
agree.
is arguably the most well-traveled individual to be elected pope.
Yes.
Yeah, and when it's a global position that that you have to be the pope of everyone, right? That
Yeah.
is a huge, huge advantage.
Yes. Okay. Just want to take a quick moment and remind our viewing audience that if you have a question for Colleen, please do drop that in the chat. We've got about a half hour left with her, so please take advantage. If you've got something you'd like to ask, we'll try to get to it. So, looking at, you mentioned a few minutes ago that Leo, it's unusual for a pope to name a president by name. You also have mentioned a couple of things that you've noticed with his papacy so far. So, when you think about Leo being so direct about this issue, this war in Iran, and his willingness to directly address Trump by name on the plane, does that track for you with what you've noticed in this papacy so far? Did it surprise you at all, just based on who Leo is and kind of his style and his tone over the past year?
I think that it fits into that narrative that I mentioned briefly before of him growing more comfortable in his public voice. So the reference point I often use for this is that last summer in like July, he gave 2 interviews to an American journalist, Elise Allen, who he had known before he was Pope. And he told her that there is a big learning curve for him in becoming a world leader and that he, really felt uncomfortable with it in some ways. Um, I would say, like, in September, we saw him start to speak out a little bit more, and then over the course of the fall, he was giving these Castel Gandolfo, Tuesday night appearances, right, where he would take some questions from the press. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. We got to, like, late January, and that wasn't happening anymore, and it looked like he was taking a much more institutional turn in his,
Mm,
communications because he came out with that January 9th speech to the
yes.
diplomats that I mentioned before, which was very critical of the US without naming the
Yeah.
US. When I read it, I was like, this was certainly drafted within the Secretariat of State at the Vatican. It was their traditional style, but also very strong.
Mhm.
Um, and that, is what some reporting has said led to this Pentagon meeting. We can perhaps talk about that with the
Yes.
nuncio.
I would love to.
Yeah, and then around the end of January, when the US was building up a lot of military presence in Venezuela, around Venezuela, um, the Pope started coming out again. And I talked to a
Mhm.
friend of his around then, and I was like, are these Tuesday night meeting's gone for good. And he was like, no, he'll do them when he has something to say.
Yeah.
And it was around then that he started
Interesting.
appearing more often. And he was quite critical of the U.S. military buildup in Venezuela and of the talks that were happening about, or the talk that was out there about, a possible military incursion, which ended up happening.
Mhm.
Uh, and then throughout this spring, he's gotten more and more direct, more and more open. Um, I wouldn't be surprised if we see him back off a little bit. I think that
Mhm.
he's a very cautious person by temperament. I think we now know he doesn't have a problem with naming Trump, but I think he will not want to be seen as talking about Trump all the time
Yeah.
either, right? Because yeah, then you'll then it'll look like he's obsessed with him. It's so
It will just feed into Trump's ego to have more
exactly, well,
attention.
and what this is really about, my editor-in-chief wrote a piece, uh, to this effect earlier this week, but, like, similar to just before the conclave when Trump released that picture of himself as Pope, the AI picture, and when he, was interviewed about, like, "Who do you want to be Pope?" And he was like, "Oh, well, my best outcome would be that I become Pope." Like,
Yeah.
he wants the attention to be on him.
Mhm.
Leo's taking that attention to the extent that it's getting, thrown to him and
Yes.
trying to redirect to "Blessed are the peacemakers."
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
but I think that, yeah, he's not gonna keep feeding into the Trump thing
No, I agree with you.
unnecessarily.
Yes, I totally agree with you. I think, one thing I noticed at the beginning when he started doing those little gaggles outside Castel Gandolfo was he seemed kind of uncomfortable at first in a way that I was sort of surprised by, like, just my impression, just kind of a gut level reaction as I was watching him talk to the press. It was sort of like you look a little, yeah, just uncomfortable, like you haven't really figured out how to do this, and, um, you're
As
maybe
a
a little
cardinal,
nervous
he
about
barely
it.
spoke to the press.
Right, and
Yeah.
yeah, and I think he probably there was a level of self-awareness of how easy it was going to be for the fact that he's an American pope for his words to get co-opted and twisted and become very sensationalized here in the United States.
Mhm.
Um,
I
so I
actually
think
think in that context, if I can throw in a note here, that
please, yeah.
it was interesting, especially in those early appearances and even now, to see how he would strategically use English, um, in those appearances, right? He will go over to the English-speaking journalists to take questions when he has something he wants to say, especially to the American audience, and he'll say it in
Mhm.
English. It's happened a couple times where he said something in English and then had to repeat it in Italian for the Italian journalists who were there.
Yes.
It's also kind of interesting that he has, in recent weeks, stopped waiting for questions. Um, a few
Yeah.
weeks ago, I think he went up to an American journalist, I think expecting to be asked about the war and was asked about something else. And so the following week, he went up to the press and he was just like, "I have something to say," and said it.
Yeah.
And
Let's go.
yeah, so he's it's a learning process for him for sure.
Yeah. I find him so lovable, honestly. Before we get to a couple of questions, can we please talk about the Avignon meeting? The
Oh
kind
my
of,
god.
yeah. 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 You had a great reel on Instagram a couple days ago, just sort of doing your own reporting and your own analysis of this situation. Um, for those of you who perhaps missed it, there was a report in the Free Press that came out either middle or late last week, alleging from an anonymous source that there had been this meeting between Vatican and Pentagon diplomats, and that in the course of that meeting, a representative from the Pentagon had thrown out the word Avignon as kind of a veiled threat to the Vatican that there was going to be increasing pressure on the Vatican to sort of comply with American will on the war. If did I characterize that correctly?
Yeah, I would say like so the Free Press's report was based on interviews with anonymous Vatican officials. They don't say how many, they don't say what these folks' rank was. They said they spoke on the condition of anonymity. We don't know exactly why. Was it that they weren't authorized, whatever. They said that these were officials who were briefed on the meeting. So we also don't know to what extent that was an official briefing or whatever. So, the point of my reel was to say, like, let's approach this with some caution because the veteran Vatican reporters who were trying to get this story confirmed were really coming up empty. Like, the most I've heard of anyone getting from any reliable source is that it was indeed a tense meeting. Um, Obviously, we had some on-record responses that were, pretty measured from the Vatican side, optimistic from the Trump side. From the Trump side, they released some photos of the meeting, people smiling, sitting at a table, whatever. Um, on the Vatican side, they were quite neutral in their tone, but they confirmed, yes, the meeting did happen, which I think it's worth pointing out. It's extremely unusual that you would have a papal nuncio, the Pope's ambassador to the US, called into the Pentagon, right? That is not a diplomatic meeting space. He was called in by the Department of Defense rather than by the
Mm,
Department of State. Um, just very interesting, very unusual.
yes.
I think it's in that context, it makes a lot of sense that it would have been a tense meeting, right? Very unusual. Yeah, I have not heard that threats were actually made. I don't know that the Avignon thing is true. Brian Birch, the U.S. ambassador to the Holy See, tweeted that he had talked to Cardinal Pierre, who is the papal nuncio, on the phone that day, and he said, "Threat of Avignon, none." So yeah, like, up to you who you believe in this he said situation.
Yeah.
But yeah, the most that I've been able to get is yes, it was in fact a tense meeting, but people have stopped short of confirming threats. Um, yeah, sorry, there was a bigger question in there, I think, and I think I forgot.
Oh, no, no. My question was really, what good information's actually out there? How credible are the stories that are being told and these big headlines? And also, even from the Vatican perspective, because as you have mentioned already in our conversation, sometimes there is the sense from the public that the Vatican's not transparent about what it's doing and what it's communicating to the public. So, I'm wondering, as a correspondent for the Vatican, what do you make of all of this? And you've mentioned, like, I'm not seeing any details coming out that I can confirm. But
Mhm.
the attention that this story has garnered and what it's kind of doing and how it's affecting the rest of all of this that we've talked about, what do you make of all of that?
Yeah. Um, so I want people to understand that in Vatican reporting, it's very common for Vatican folk to only want to speak anonymously. It's almost taken as like a norm there. And different publications, especially even different cultures, will have different um, levels of whether they're okay with that, basically.
Mhm.
Um, I'll say, yeah, I think that, we should approach what's said anonymously with a critical mind. And so working for that confirmation is really, really important. I often say, like, if you have something anonymously, you should get it from 3 different sources. Uh, if you can't get one on the record, you need 3 anonymous to corroborate, and that they should be people who are not, like, good friends with each other. It would be very easy to get 3 people together in the Vatican to push out a story that's not true. So you gotta be really, really critically thinking about this stuff. Now I don't know, what the practice was, what the process was for the reporter from the Free Press. He may well have done all of this, and it could just be that none of the other reporters are able to get it. That's totally possible. But yeah, so that's kind of a general take on it. I would say, in terms of Vatican transparency, the influence of an American pope is very interesting, um, because he knows that there is that perception, and we see him pushing back on it when he is one-on-one with the press. Here he is saying, like, "Yes, in fact, I have read the social media post. Here's my response to it." Quite direct, saying it to every single person who asks him about it on the plane. Um, I'll be interested to see what Pope Leo does with the Vatican's communications operation too, because he has a chance to reshape it. And I think if you ask a lot of Vatican reporters, an overhaul of that office, or at least like a reimagining of their communication strategy, has been needed for a long time.
Mm.
Um, they've had some very competent people running it, and even like 2 of them back in I want to say 2016, resigned because their reforms, what they were trying to do, were going nowhere. Um, so yeah, that's just a few more thoughts on that.
Great. Thanks. That's so helpful. It's really amazing just that insider perspective that you have, and I think it speaks to your credibility as a journalist and just how much trust you've built with your sources over the years that you've done this work. I want to go to a couple of questions from our audience. Frank asks, do you think Pope Leo is concerned about the direction of evangelicals in America as moving their allegiance more to Trump than the gospel?
It's an interesting question. He certainly hasn't given us too many comments directly about this. I will say that um, maybe the most relevant recent comment was on Palm Sunday when he said, "No one can use Jesus' name to justify war." If you look at the main parties in the Iran war, right, you have a Muslim nation, a Jewish nation, and a majority Christian nation. And so certainly that was an appeal to the Christians who are using our religion to justify the war.
And many
Um,
people interpreted that as kind of a very not so oblique reference to Pete Hegseth's prayers and continuous
yes, his
biblical
prayer
language
service at the Pentagon, where he prayed for overwhelming violence of destruction, something like that,
against
on
those who
on
receive
people who
no
deserve no
mercy.
mercy. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Mhm.
Wild. Okay. Yep.
Yeah, although there was that earlier comment from Pope Leo where he said, "Do the Christians involved in this war have the courage to make an examination of conscience and go to confession?" This was in the context of a speech he was giving to priests and seminarians about the sacrament of confession, and people took that as a call out of Marco Rubio and
Mm-hmm,
JD Vance because,
mm-hmm.
they're Catholics who would presumably go to confession.
JD Vance's comments in the last couple of days have been very interesting and disappointing for me. I think I hoped for better from him, but to see
Mm.
him come in front of the press and say, I kind of wish that the Pope would stick to morals, as if the issue of war has nothing to do with morality and ethics
The
is
one
sort of
this
strange.
morning was very puzzling when he said, "I think the Pope needs to be very careful when talking about theology." It's like this is a man with much more theological background than you. Yeah,
Yes, and absolutely not to disparage people who are newly entered the church, but in terms of just
certainly.
your background, JD Vance is still new to the Catholic tradition, and it's just been really interesting and saddening for me to see kind of the development there. Like I said, I hope for more from him,
Mm.
but it's not ultimately that unpredictable, to be honest. So, okay, what else do we got here? Oh, sorry, I lost it. Trump holds on to perceived challenges from anyone. Do you think his comments and criticism, which are sure to come, will cause more separation between Catholics and Protestants in the United States?
Ooh, um, I'm not sure, and I'm not sure because of the responses that I've seen from the Trump evangelical base this week.
They've been very
Trump
critical. Not happy.
Trump really got on the wrong side
Yeah, he did.
of that audience with the Jesus image, with the doctor image. And so I don't know. I mean, I don't see like a mass shift of, you know, non-Catholic Christians like being like, I'm on the Pope's side. But yeah, certainly he's alienated a good bit of his base with that image.
Yes. Dylan Doherty says, "Do you think the nuncio being called to the Pentagon rather than a State Department location is due to Secretary Rubio being Catholic?"
I don't know. I had not thought about that. Uh, I suppose it's possible, but I don't think I can really speak to it.
Okay. Um, let's see. As this is Timothy, he says, as the Pope and President likely continue to be at odds going forward, how can we, I'm assuming Catholics, avoid getting sucked into the same sensationalism cycles that have brought us here and keep our eyes focused on Jesus and the gospel message that the Pope wants us to focus on?
Yeah, I'm going to refer again to that piece that our editor in chief Sam Sawyer wrote on Monday, because at the end of it, he has a call to action, which is, his article is basically that Trump is trying to make this whole thing about himself, right? he's trying to distract us from Leo's message. And so we should double down as Catholics on our prayers for peace, on our, work to do what Leo has been urging us to do since the very beginning of his pontificate, which is to disarm ourselves in whatever ways that we can in our daily lives, right? Disarm our language, he says, disarm our, not adopt a defensive or even aggressive approach in our interpersonal relationships. Do what we can to speak out for peace. Leo even said last week or 2 weeks ago, I guess, to call your congresspeople, right? Which I think was
Mhm.
also maybe an unprecedented call from a sitting pope. Certainly, it's something that like plays into some of the historic fears of the pope having an outsized influence on the American voting populace. Um, so much interesting history
That
here
it
to
is.
dig into some other time. But yeah, so doubling down on your prayers for peace, contacting your congresspeople, working to build peace within your own life, I think are the key areas that
Yeah.
Leo would push us towards.
It's so interesting to me that "Peace be with you" is the very first words we hear from this pope. It's it's kinda weird. It's not that this all comes out of nowhere, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it's
It's scriptural, obviously, yeah.
right, and the events that we're seeing unfold in the Middle East right now and this increasing involvement in war making and violence by the United States military, not entirely out of the blue, not, like, entirely unexpected, but it is just so interesting still to me that the first message we get from this pope is "Peace be with you," and the consistency with which he has proclaimed that message throughout his pontificate. So the credibility that he has when he speaks about it now is 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 very high. And
Mhm.
I've seen some reporting just on kind of favorability numbers, and Pope Leo is up, 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 up.
Yeah.
Trump is underwater, in almost every sense of that you can come at it. And it is just an interesting, and like I said, I don't really agree with this sort of Trump versus Pope paradigm that's kind of happening in the media as sort of an absolute interpretation of Pope Leo. But it's a really interesting witness to see Trump, who campaigned on peace, who campaigned promising to end forever wars, global wars, and US interventionism abroad. And here we are, and the
Who
hypocrisy
who
and
campaigned not only to the voters on that, but who campaigned for a Nobel Peace Prize.
yeah, yes,
Yeah.
yes. So just the juxtaposition, the contrast there between the flip flop from Trump versus just the consistency that we've seen from Leo.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Okay, I think we're good on questions. So
Okay.
speaking of Trump, he won the Catholic vote by
Mhm.
a pretty large margin in 2024. And I'm wondering what you think about this ongoing clash between Trump and Leo and what that means for, I'm thinking here specifically of American Catholics who voted for Donald Trump, and maybe even those Catholics who are still inclined to support him in this moment. What would you say to those Catholics? And I'm
I
kinda
think
asking you to speak to speak not necessarily just as a straight journalist, but, someone who sees the ins and outs of this stuff every day.
Mhm. I think gosh, I had a really good conversation with my book editor who I think is watching right now. I hope I represent this accurately. But we were talking yesterday about, you know, how Catholics are meant to be politically homeless, right? Our beliefs do not graft nicely onto one or the other major political party. I am of the belief, based on what I've seen from polling numbers, that like the Catholic vote is kind of a myth. That if you look at the like education, race, geography, gender, etc. breakdowns of the way that U.S. Catholics vote, generally they just vote with their cohorts on these other things. And so I have what could be a jaded view that is the Catholics aren't really. I think that they're informed by their faith, but that it may not be the decider for a lot of them. Um, but I'd say, if you're serious about your faith, then it should make you uncomfortable in the political sphere. And I think if right now you're seeing what's going on, you're feeling a pull between the Pope and the president, um, it's worth looking into why it is the Pope says the things he says. It's worth seeing what he says about peace. And, I was formed in the Ignatian tradition, so like discernment of spirits is a big thing for me. But paying attention to like the movements of the spirit in your heart and what you think is being said to you, um, I think is the way to discern your vote, other things in your life too. Also, I think, I'm not gonna say like every Trump supporter is wrong, whatever. But I think that we all need to be a little bit more okay with admitting that we're wrong sometimes too.
Mhm. Thanks for that. So you said a few minutes ago you expect that probably going forward, Leo might back off of this conflict. That's kind of your expectation.
I wouldn't
Anything
wouldn't be surprised if he did, yeah.
wouldn't be surprised. Anything else you're watching for in the coming weeks as this developing story continues to unfold?
Well, certainly I'll have my eye out for if he does comment directly on this. I'll also have my eye out for if he is dodging any questions. Right now, he's on this trip across Africa, which means that there are chances for at least a few papal airborne press conferences. So he will almost definitely have one at the end of this trip when he flies back on, I believe, the 23rd of April to Rome. That's usually when we get like the big ones where he takes
Mhm.
questions from all the different language groups on the plane. Um, so I'm sure that he'll be asked again about, what has come out in this conflict since then, especially by the English language group, because they'll be really interested. Um, I think it's worth paying attention to what he says about peace in these various African nations he's visiting, because many of them have been touched by war in like the last 50 years. Um, so he's almost certainly going to stick with that message, right? Yeah, there may be some things that are interpreted as veiled references to what's going on in the world today, or like the responsibilities of the United States, etc. Um, but yeah, I'll keep my eye out for that papal press conference certainly, and then I think he's just gonna be continuing to hammer home the message of peace. I think he's serious about it. I'm interested also. His two kind of priorities are peace and unity. And obviously they're related, but he's been really concerned about the disunity, especially in the US Catholic Church and in the US like as a whole. He's concerned about it all over the world, but this is what we talk about.
Yes.
And I think he knows that this is a divisive moment, but also one where I think he thinks he can bring people together best by just preaching the gospel, right? By just trying to point towards peace, the call to peace all the time. Um, I don't know that it will have the effect of uniting people, but it's worth a shot, right? I think that that'll be his technique, but I'll be interested to see if I'm right about that, or if he's gonna, try some other way to appeal for unity across the US. Obviously, the other big thing to mention here is that on July 3rd, he's gonna give an address specifically to the US on the occasion of our 250th anniversary, when he's receiving a medal from the National Constitution Center, their Liberty
Mm,
Medal. So that'll be a time when he is specifically focused on the United States, and he'll be speaking to us in English, although
on a
not
major
from.
American
Yeah.
holiday that
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Not on the day itself, because that
right.
day he's going to Lampedusa to
Yeah.
pay attention to migrants, which I think is also a message to us.
Mhm.
And he'll be speaking by video link. But the interesting part of this all is that like Trump has nothing to do with that ceremony. So this will be his chance
Mm.
to speak directly to the American people.
I definitely look forward to hearing what he says there. Have you heard anything about his encyclical that's set to come out?
Oh, yes, I am expecting it probably sometime in May.
Okay.
Um, a lot of people have talked about it as like the AI encyclical. I think it's going to be broader than that, but that AI is going to get a section. I don't think that they would do a just AI encyclical, because that's it would get dated so fast. One, but two, like much like Laudato Si was not just about the environment, right? It was about like integral human ecology is what the Vatican brands it as.
Yeah.
It was as much about poverty, at least, as it was about the environment, right? I think that the AI encyclical will have a similarly broad approach to
Mhm.
that issue. Yeah.
Awesome. I That's another thing I'm very much looking forward to reading from
So
Leo.
yeah.
Okay, before you go, and last call for questions, but before you go, can we talk a little bit about your book and
Sure.
yeah, just go back to why you wrote it and who should read it?
Yeah. So I wrote this, it was all finished before Pope Francis died, so it seems a little bit dated now, in terms of the news. But basically, as a Catholic, like, reporting on the Vatican, I have to cover a lot of things that really shake up my faith and make me ask questions about whether I can, in good conscience, remain in this institution, whether I feel okay with publicly representing the Catholic Church. And also on a personal faith level, just like the times that I am so angry at the church for its shortcomings, especially around something like the sex abuse crisis, right? How am I then to find comfort in the church? So all these things were swirling around in my head. I obviously have conversations with people all the time where they're like, hey, I saw this headline. One, what the heck is happening? Please explain it. And two, like, what does this mean for me as a Catholic? So I wrote this book. Each chapter goes through one of the scandals that I've covered or one of the like big stories that I've had to kind of wrestle with. And I talk about how while covering this story, I was kind of negotiating, wrestling with, praying through my own relationship with God, with the church. And so I think that it's for anybody who wants to maybe one, learn a little more about these stories beyond just like the headlines that you've seen. I get into a little bit of analysis of like root causes, why these things are happening. I try to raise up some stories that are less paid attention to, like the abuse of, women who are cleaning cardinals' houses, for example. Um, and then also for anybody who, yeah, sees headlines and is feeling conflicted about their faith. I think this book is not one that gives people answers. I certainly don't see myself as like a spiritual guru or example, but I want people to read it and feel less alone and less like, maybe having conflicting feelings about the church makes them a bad Catholic. Because it
Mm.
doesn't. It's I have felt the call to wrestle with my faith as something that's like genuinely part of my vocation as a Catholic. And I want to share that with people so that they feel like they can do that wrestling too if they feel called to it.
I did do a little bit of stalking, not like stalking, but homework on you before we had this conversation, and I heard you talking on gospel simplicity about your book. And one thing you shared with, the host of that podcast was about that idea of wrestling and that passage in scripture about Jacob wrestling with God, um, through the night and how that has sort of shaped the way that you view what you're calling your wrestling appropriately. So what what does that look like for you, and what meaning has that added to your life of faith?
I think the big lesson for me has been to take the conflict that I feel about my faith and bring it to God, and not be afraid of doing so. That's kind of chapter one of the book is like learning how to yell at God, learning that what I don't have to hide this stuff. I don't have to pretend that I don't have doubts or anger or anything. That it works out better when I bring it to God. And so that's kind of the thing that I've held on to. Um, as I've, gone through many other scandals and had to cover them over the years. Um, I will say that I think that that was like a certain phase of my life as a Catholic. And now I feel in a much less conflicted place. I think maybe I've done a lot of the wrestling and, I don't know, I say often that, like, having a kid has changed my spirituality quite a bit, because it has brought me back to the absolute essentials, the basics. Maybe you feel that as a mom too,
I
I
was
don't
gonna
know.
say I can absolutely relate to
Yeah,
that.
yeah, which is not like, it doesn't mean that the faith comes easy. It doesn't mean that I
No.
don't feel angry, and certainly there are a lot of things that I wanna, like, logic through, pray through, examine for myself. I haven't like lost my critical thinking, but yeah, for many years that was kind of a part of my prayer life was having to bring the stories I was covering and the anger I was feeling in response and say, "Hey God, like what the hell?"
Yes. Yeah, this makes me think of a book that just came out in April from James K. A. Smith, who I actually don't know his tradition, but it's called Make Your Home in This Luminous Dark, and it's about a lot of the things that you just mentioned about kind of how, as we mature in our faith, there's a process of sort of stripping that I'm going to, as you said, logic this out. I'm gonna figure it out, and I'm gonna find the answers. And we can, if we choose, sort of enter into this more freedom in the unknowing and freedom in the uncertainty and, for lack of a better word, the gray area or just the mess of things, and that God really meets us there, and that's actually kind of a path. He argues it's a path of mysticism, actually,
Mm,
kind of letting go of this need to know everything.
yeah, Jamie Smith, I think is Protestant, but he has a really deep knowledge of the Augustinian tradition, which is interesting. He so the tradition that Pope Leo was formed in. Um,
Yes,
yeah, he's definitely grounded in that.
very cool. Colleen, where can people find you, and how can they pick up a copy of your book?
Sure. Unfortunately, you just missed a Kindle sale.
Oh, no.
But yeah, it's wherever you get your books. It's published by Penguin Random House, so it's widely available. There's an audiobook also that I read if you aren't tired of hearing me talk. um, yeah, it's an ebook, it's in print. I'm sure you can probably find it secondhand by now. At least one person has seen it in a little free library. And then I have a podcast called Inside the Vatican that I do every week. It's on YouTube if you like to watch your podcasts. If you like audio, you can find it on Spotify or any other big podcast app. And I write for America Magazine. That's just americamagazine.org. We also have print subscriptions. I occasionally appear in the print issue, but yeah.
Awesome. Colleen, thank you so much for joining us, and
Thank you,
I hope
Sarah.
I hope we can
Thanks
hear
for a
from
good
you again
discussion.
sometime. Yeah, of course. No, I'm so grateful. It's, and robust engagement in the comments. Lots of people had lots of things to say, and I saw so much just complimentary, like, "I loved your book. Thank you for being
Oh,
here."
good.
So it's
I couldn't keep up with them. I'm scrolling through them
yeah,
now.
let me keep up with it for you. There were so many people who yeah, have just been commenting how grateful they are for you, for your writing, and for your work. So
Well, I
we're
see
so
some
glad that you
familiar
guys
names. Thanks for joining, y'all.
yeah. Alright, well, bless
Right.
you, and, we'll talk
Thanks.
soon.
Oh, people who are in Chicago, I have an event tonight. I have to run to the airport right after this. At Loyola Chicago, it's me, Gretchen Crow from Our Sunday Visitor, Dominic Preziosi from Commonweal is mediating it, and Michael Sean Winters from National Catholic Reporter. Loyola Chicago, there's a link on my Instagram to register for it if you would like to come this evening. Yeah.
Alright, everybody in
Okay.
Chicago,
Come on out.
go buy Colleen's book. Thank you so much for being here. Safe travels.
Thanks, Sarah.
We'll
Okay,
talk soon.
peace.
Bye.
Bye.